Hello, how you going, random strangers? We are kickstarting season 2 of Fate series today, which I imagine will be the season for murder, given that out of the 7 servants, only Assassin has been eliminated, and only because they were treated, I guess, as dispensable fodder by Tokiyomi and Kirei, so I kind of felt bad for them. Tokiyomi and Kirei, speaking of which, whose alliance looks like it's about to fall apart because Archer managed to sweet talk Kirei into unearthing that part of him that really relishes human drama and suffering, which then led him to getting his command seals back so that he could discover his true purpose more, which then cleared the way for Archer's next move, which most likely involves ditching Tokiyomi and then hoping that Kirei will shack up with him eventually. Betrayal and murder is basically the reason why we're all here, right? Which is the point that Nice Nor made in a comment. Ryuunosuke's idea of the world being like a play and getting entertainment out of both heroism and tragedy, and Gilgamesh's fascination with others and their despair is akin to how we are watching a pretty dark story and getting enjoyment out of it. So yeah, it's a disturbing idea that on some level we share with them a similar fascination with suffering, in that we find value in contemplating the adversity and the pain that shapes the characters in Fate. Of course, Ryuunosuke, takes that fascination to an uber messed up level, because he doesn't just contemplate suffering, he enjoys causing great suffering. That was some really good meta commentary. Basically, humans are going to human, and suffering will always hold some degree of appeal to a lot of us. It's like that irresistible urge to look back at the terrible car crash that you just drove past. And the reason why reality TV is still so popular, and the reason why subreddits like Am I the Asshole exist. People just like gathering to sort of sip their tea and moralize and have their say about terrible situations that other people find themselves in. Maybe a part of it is a sense of relief at knowing that there's always going to be someone else out there who's worse off than you. But a more positive spin on that, right? Suffering is an inevitable part of human existence. So isn't it better to contemplate other people's suffering in order to learn from them than to bury your head in the sand and not engage? Like, personally, even if I can admit that I am interested to some extent in drama, I don't enjoy the fact that other people suffer. I feel sad for them. That's normal, right? But yeah, ultimately, I think it is compelling that characters like Ryuunosuke and Gil and Kirei and their fascination with human suffering throws a kind of uncomfortable light on how people often do get some catharsis from other people's pain, even if it's not to the same extent that those characters do, or it's not in a malicious way. Episode 12 opened with a briefing between Tokiyomi and Kirei, who were kind of stumped by how OP Ryder's Ionian heteroi was, and were strategizing how to deal with that. As Kiritsugu pointed out, it would be a mistake to underestimate Ryder, even though he sort of presents as this big friendly giant and subscribes to a similar honor code as Saber. We found out just how idealistic Ryder is, how tightly he holds on to his dream of conquering the world and, of reaching that proverbial distant shore. And it hit me that the danger that Ryder's enemies see in him is connected intimately, or is a consequence of that idealism. It's the dreamers, the people who relentlessly pour their energy and their lives into chasing impossible dreams, who are the truly dangerous ones. It's kind of like that quote from one of my favorite movies of all time, V4 Vendetta. You can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea. And that literally describes Ryder's journey from being Alexander the Great to then becoming a Grail servant. In my view, Ryder's dangerous, not just because he is a great fighter and has an amazing, powerful, noble phantasm, but also because he's driven by a crazy idea that is much, much greater than himself. And if you are obsessed with a limitless dream, then the ferocity and the lengths to which you will go to achieve that dream will also themselves be limitless. I mean, his noble phantasm is essentially him having infected an entire army of servants with his own dream. So yeah, it's incredibly smart to put Ryder up there as one of the biggest threats. There's something really captivating about Kiritsugu munching away on a sandwich while he analyzes the intel that he's collected on that wall. He feels like the type who doesn't care at all what he's eating. You know, food is just fuel for his brain to keep it working and so that he can keep mapping out what to do about the remaining servants and masters. You know, there's no enjoyment in it for him. And as always, he was again encased in shadows and these really drab sort of settings. And I think that partly reflects his fighting style. You know, he strikes from the shadows and isn't above using so-called underhanded tactics to win and to get the job done, which Saber hates. But I also feel the lurking around in shadows reflects to the lack of color in Kiritsugu's life. You know, a lack of any other source of joy or satisfaction outside of his sole focus on winning the Grail War. I think he chooses to not feel joy for the sake of winning. He suppresses anything that might distract him, even if it makes him happy. You know, though he mostly acts in a really ruthless manner, we've seen that he still experiences this inner conflict about the kind of person that he's become and the choices that he's made. I always think back to when he lost his composure in front of Irisfield and just was crying to her about wanting to quit the war and spend time together as a family. He's struck a really fragile balance between cold rationality on the one hand and then the passionate idealist part of him on the other. And it feels like he deliberately became this shell of a human being or like this killing machine by convincing himself that the only way to achieve his end goal and his idea of the ultimate good, namely a world without war, was to squeeze out all the warmth and humanity that he had in him and to reduce himself down into a cold, calculating zealot that will see the mission through regardless of the cost, and to become the kind of person who is okay with sacrificing the few for the many. He's a classic anti-hero. The morality of his means will always sit uncomfortably with, alongside his very noble ends. And only in rare instances did we still glimpse the humanity that's in him. You know, like instead of blowing up the entire building that Kenneth was in, he gave people a chance to escape. That makes Kiritsugu a really fascinating foil for Kirei. Kirei thinks that he and Kiritsugu are the same kind of people. Cold-hearted bastards who have nothing to live for and who aren't constrained by any morals or values system. But the more we learn of Kirei, the more I feel like he is actually the anti-Kiritsugu. Because Kiritsugu, he suppresses emotions and morality for the sake of achieving justice, you know, of ending war for all time. He has people who love him and who he loves, you know, and he does understand pleasure. He's just chosen to sacrifice that to pursue a greater good. And that actually makes him a really relatable character because it raises questions about ourselves. What are we willing to sacrifice, or who are we willing to walk over for the sake of achieving a longer term goal? And, you know, should we or shouldn't we make those kinds of sacrifices? Whereas Kirei, he has nothing to suppress because he has no emotion. You know, he lacks understanding about love or about pleasure. And until he spoke to Gilgamesh, he had nothing in the world that he wanted or was even interested in wanting. In short, what separates Kirei and Kiritsugu is the capacity to feel the full range of emotions that a normal human being feels. Unlike Kiritsugu, who loves and has very complex emotions and is moved by great anger against injustice. Like, remember when he got mad at the idea of Saber being made a king when she was just a child? Kirei, by contrast, is an emotional blank. He has struggled to understand, let alone feel this purposelessness that has defined him his entire life. And I think his obsession with Kiritsugu stems maybe from his hope that someone else out there is just as blank as he is. But unfortunately, well, fortunately, I don't know, he is wrong. And I think he's going to be pissed the second he realizes that Kiritsugu is nothing like him. Which leads us to this amazingly packed scene between Kirei and Archer, in which Kirei starts to feel something. Watching this extended dialogue was like kind of like watching a fish get slowly reeled in by a master manipulator. Gilgamesh laid down one by one the foundational blocks that opened Kirei's eyes to the fact that he does have a desire, the desire to understand and be entertained by the pain of being human. And the fact that we had two characters carrying on this sort of Socratic dialogue about what desire is and what pleasure is and how they reflect the soul firmly puts Fate Zero into sort of like A-grade anime territory. And I really appreciated it and I loved every second of it. Gil started off easy. You know that psychological trick that you pull on someone when you want to talk about them, but you start off with something seemingly unrelated and then just wheedle your way towards their issue? That's exactly what Gil did when he started telling Kirei about his newest form of entertainment, you know, Saber and her utopian dream of saving Britain. And he's fascinated by how she's fooled herself into believing that it's something that she should want, let alone something that's even possible. Basically, he thinks it's dumb. Not because Saber is incapable, but because the dream itself is ridiculous. From his perspective, you know, what is dumber than a king bent on sacrificing themselves for their people when it really should be the other way around? That's why Archer has like a begrudging respect for Saber. Oh, I mean, not really respect as like a condescending, oh, how adorable is this dum-dum. So intense and potent was Saber's will to fix her mistakes that she transcended her own humanity and became a servant for a chance to rewrite history from beyond the grave. And that kind of stubbornness, though foolish, is endearing in a really entertaining kind of way. However, Gil is a demigod who at this stage hasn't really had to contend with the limits of being human, even though he is himself half mortal. Later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you know, he definitely tempers his pride and makes peace with that mortal part of himself. But for now, in Fate Zero, he is a misanthropist, like to the max. He holds so much contempt for humanity that he is ironically entertained by it. And I think that is why I like Gilgamesh so much as a character, even though there is nothing honorable or good about him. He is just a god who freaking hates being bored. And Kirei's weird complex happens to be the least boring thing around. With Saber, I mean, we've talked about it before, Archer is just sticking around to see how close she gets to the Grail. He doesn't believe, of course, that she'll succeed because he is in the way and he won't let her, but it'll be fun all the same, you know, according to him. Kind of like watching a train wreck happen in slow motion, to watch the painful ups and downs of her journey towards inevitable failure. The discussion around command seals was probably the first confirmation that we got of Archer hatching a plan to get rid of Tokiyomi. So in theory, just to revise, if a servant dies, a master's command seals return to the Grail. And if a master dies, the servant and the command seals will be redistributed to a new master. And because so few people qualify as a master, the Grail tends to choose someone that's already been, I guess, pre-approved. And that's why the other masters try to kill any unpaired masters to prevent them from possibly becoming reinstated in the war. There was some very not subtle foreshadowing in the animation as Kirei explained all this. So Archer's chess piece was shown with a fallen master in front, clearly representing Tokiyomi, and then a new master that's standing just to the side, obviously Kirei. And Gilgamesh never explicitly says Kirei should pair up with him, not even at the end when he told Kirei that he'd need to steal a servant off an existing master, I wonder who, to continue his quest to understand his desire. And it was really just all in the visual clues and in Gil's very naked, selfish motive for planting the idea in Kirei's head in the first place. My understanding is that it was extremely odd for the Grail to have returned the command seals to Kirei so soon, especially as no servant has really been freed up yet. And even Gil was surprised at how quickly it happened. And I think that speaks to how strong Kirei's desire to know himself is, despite being so deeply buried to the point of him not even being aware of its existence. But the Grail knew. It also showed that Archer did a hell of a job opening Kirei's mind up to the possibility that he might have a purpose other than the one that Chokiyomi fed him, which was just to be support crew or like a wingman for the Torsuckers and the church. It's Gil, he had this whole conversation planned out and he knew exactly what to say to lead Kirei to the conclusion that he wanted. And I think that is another form of power at play here in the Grail War. You know, it's not just about pure force and magical power, but also the ability to get into people's heads and to manipulate their thinking. So yeah, kudos to Gil for really peeling back Kirei's layers and probably unleashing a bigger monster in the process. You have to wonder if Kirei believed his own words about how Tokiyomi's victory is pretty much set in stone and that he's done his part, you know, he's done. But Archer specifically aimed to unearth the existing doubt in Kirei's mind regarding Tokiyomi and his so-called noble pursuit of the root. You know, maybe Tokiyomi's not all that. The flat tone with which Kirei expressed surprise at Archer's disdain for Tokiyomi suggested that he wasn't really surprised and maybe even shares similar feelings. And I sense Kirei thinks that Tokiyomi's ambition, you know, while representing the pinnacle of what a mage is all about, is ultimately beneath what the Grail could be used for. Like, why waste the Grail on something so boring and dry as attaining even more magical knowledge and power? Surely there must be more riveting or meaningful wishes you could ask it for. And I don't actually know what I would ask the Grail for. I feel like it would be just one of those things where it's a double-edged sword. You know, you ask for one thing and you get it, but it comes with a whole bunch of negative and unforeseen, you know, gifts that turn out to be curses, and you're just like, oh, I wish I never did it in the first place. But anyway, yeah, definitely probably would just ask for I don't know, for an endless supply of free potatoes. I just love potatoes. To help Kirei discover more about what those meaningful wishes might be that he could ask from the Grail, Archer pretended to want to know, or maybe he actually did want to know, what is motivating each master to fight for the Grail, but he had to hear it from Kirei. Why? Because it was a way for him to make Kirei realize that he is actually a lot more invested in the Grail War than he thinks, which in turn set him up to realize that he has a desire and that he can actually use the Grail to better understand and address that desire, which then gave Gil an in for setting up Kirei to be his new master. A secondary motivation for Gilgamesh might be his own fascination with Kirei. Like, wow, here is a guy just like me who's a bit obsessed with human tragedy. And on top of that, he doesn't even know it yet. So, like, what a specimen. Let's dig into it. He definitely seems to get a kick out of helping Kirei discover that human suffering can be fun, just to prove that he can. There's absolutely zero altruism in Gilgamesh's actions. It all comes back to what will get him what he wants, and as a bonus, you know, what will entertain him in any given moment. Gilgamesh said something quite introspective about desire. Our soul, or the core of who we are, shapes our interests and desires, and consequently how we pursue them through our behaviors. On the flip side, for someone to lack any interest, i.e. Kirei, or any desires would imply that they have no soul or no substance to their being, which would explain why Kirei radiates just an unusual emptiness. He has no desire for like fame or glory or any kind of pleasure, and he's not driven by like a reactionary response to any regrets or trauma that he's had, nor is he driven by a desire to fight for very nebulous concepts like justice or world peace. So as a result, he can't relate to anyone because, you know, all humans, including the other masters, seem to desire something that falls into one of those buckets. And to me, it's quite unnerving, you know, the idea that someone could be so devoid of the most basic human needs or aspirations. Socrates, right? He defined our desires as things we don't have, things we are not, and things we are in need of. So according to that definition, Kirei didn't lack desire so much as not recognize the form that it took, because he has been searching for something he felt he didn't have, i.e. something to explain or to fix the emptiness or the nothingness inside him. And after talking to Gil, he not only discovered that there is something there, you know, there is a desire there, but also that it's a desire for something highly unusual and, in Gil's eyes at least, superior compared to what most other people want. And that is the desire to contemplate human suffering. And it's probably because of how unusual this desire is that Kirei wrongly concluded that he had none. Another fascinating reason is probably because he was brought up in the church, which would have dictated he think about desire very differently and in a way that didn't match to his natural inclinations. And that's something that we'll discuss later when we get to some other comments. In terms of the other masters, Kirei doesn't really think much of them. He dismisses Waver and Kenneth because they're much like all the other mages, including Shokuyomi. They just want more power and glory. Ryuunosuke is equally, if not more basic, because he's completely ignorant of what the Grail is and just wants to satisfy his sick desire to kill. Curiously though, the master Kirei goes into most detail about is Kariya. He refuses to talk about Kiritsugu, which we will also talk about later. But the question is why? Why does Kariya's bargain with Zorkin, where he secures the Grail in exchange for Sakura's life, intrigue Kirei so much? And I guess it's partly because Kariya is acting in a way that appears selfless. He could have easily kept avoiding Zorkin and his connection to the very disgraced Mato legacy, but instead he came back home to offer himself up as a master, not to really redeem that legacy or for his own gain, but to save his enemy's daughter. And that kind of irrational selflessness has really got a mess with Kirei's head. As we saw when he attacked Iris villain Maya, he does not understand why someone would sacrifice themselves for someone else. And because he doesn't understand, it keeps him interested and sort of like pulling on that thread until he does get it. There was a hint that Kariya might also be doing all of this for the sake of Aoi, Tokiyomi's wife, which is super spicy. It may or may not be a romantic attachment, but there is, again, like a loyalty there that puzzles Kirei. Maybe he's also intrigued that Kariya might be suffering from an unrequited love, which is, you know, max pain. Also, there's other things, right? He might also be considering Kariya that he has a bunch of unresolved daddy issues. His actions actually might not be purely selfless. They could also be his own acts of rebellion against Zorkin, who clearly was an abusive, psychotic dad that didn't so much raise his kids as breed them for their magical abilities and use them for his own selfish purposes. I think that all of that put together is what Kirei found unrefined and banal. The fact that Kariya is dealing with a horrible family situation and a potentially dead-end romantic life in a very human, impulsive and ultimately non-productive way. Kariya will never redeem himself in Zorkin's eyes, even if he won the Grail, because one, the worm magic would have got to him and killed him, probably, and two, Zorkin doesn't care about him as a son anyway. Moreover, Kariya can try to absolve his guilt over Sakura, but she's already been hurt. Nothing will ever undo what's been done to her. Same with Aoi. She will never return the love that Kariya seems to have for her, and so it's all pointless. And yet, Kariya insists on pursuing this self-destructive path. But if it's all pointless, why did Gilgamesh detect in Kirei this excitement, through his investigating Kariya and trying to understand his situation? And the answer is that Kirei voyeuristically enjoys thinking about the tragedy in other people's lives. He just doesn't know it yet. Once Gil got Kirei to that point, Kirei tried to make excuses for showing the interest that he did, like, oh, I thought Kariya would be more of a threat than he turned out to be. But Archer, I think, cleverly shot those down by just casually suggesting Kirei try and imagine what it'd be like if Kariya actually won the Grail. And the fact that Kirei immediately went to imagine that near impossible scenario proved that his interest in Kariya's situation went beyond assessing threat level. He knew it was pointless to consider Kariya's victory because, it has zero chance of happening, but he did it anyway. Even though Kariya's situation is arguably the most hopeless, it is also wrapped up in the juiciest human drama and therefore is worth the brain space. Basically, Kirei has discovered the guilty pleasure that we all get from watching reality TV. So I guess in that way, he's kind of relatable, although there's definitely a lot more going on beneath the surface that I think makes him very scary and increasingly unrelatable. Also, I think being so disconnected from other people ironically heightens his fascination with the drama and all the shit that they get into with each other. The fact that his own life has always been so rigid and predictable makes him deeply entertained by those whose lives are completely out of whack. And also the fact that he is coldly logical makes it almost fun to be condescending towards those who are the total opposite of that. The interesting question that follows on from that is it wrong to enjoy the pain and suffering of others? Arguably, Kirei is not causing the suffering, at least he's not yet. He is just interested in it. But Kirei clearly thinks that it's wrong. And first wave negativity hit on some really interesting reasons for why Kirei resisted admitting that he derives any enjoyment from Kariya's fate. They wrote, Fate Zero is a lot of things, but one of the favourite ways I've heard it described, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, was as a story of a man learning to enjoy life, with reference to Kirei. You mentioned something along the lines of there being indications of a strong repression of his feelings, and I totally agree. Gilgamesh accurately pointed out that while pleasure could be found in evil, Kirei thought of pleasure itself as evil. It cuts to the very essence of Christianity, where thoughts and feelings can themselves be sinful, and one's chance to reach salvation is through love, the love of God, which the faithful consider the ultimate comfort and joy. But what if one does not love? Emotions are not choices after all. Joy does not come from a rational calculus. Even assuming the premises are true, just because you should love someone does not mean you will. And in parallel to this, we have Kirei, who was raised to believe the only acceptable forms of pleasure come from following the moral teachings of his church and doing its bidding. Thanks for sending that in. And I read a lot of that quote because I think this is where the real can of worms is. This issue of Kirei's religion and why Gil's suggestion that joy can be found in other people's suffering was so abhorrent to him. And look, as someone who grew up in a church, I weirdly kind of get Kirei's struggle. The idea of finding any measure of joy in human suffering challenges core Christian tenets that would have, I imagine, triggered a lot of guilt and an identity crisis, but also freed Kirei to be who he is deep down. There are extreme Christian denominations who practice total abstinence from all kinds of pleasure. Think of the lifelong celibacy of Catholic priests or Christians who will sell all of their material possessions. They all practice a form of asceticism, the idea that denying yourself worldly pleasures results in a higher spiritual state. Conversely, if you get caught up in worldly affairs, your connection to God suffers. And we don't know if Kirei grew up on this sort of ascetic philosophy, but as an elite executor of the church, I reckon it was likely that he went through a very grueling training process, not just physically, but also mentally, in terms of being conditioned to believe that extreme denial of self, or even maybe submitting to voluntary pain, leads to purity and to God. Even then, I don't think Kirei necessarily thought of pleasure itself as evil. He may appear to cling to religious dogma, but I think more out of ingrained habit than anything else. And my hunch is that the church is just something that he was born into. It gave some measure of stability and guidance in his life, which is better than nothing, right? Or at least better than trying to cope with the meaningless void that is human existence. Also, most Christians or Catholics subscribe to this concept of God-given pleasures. Pleasure itself isn't sinful, depending on the context. For example, enjoying food is natural and good as long as it doesn't turn into gluttony. The desire for sex is good if it's within the context of marriage. These lines are drawn to determine when God-given pleasure turns into sinful pleasure. And where these lines should be drawn are sometimes very heatedly debated within the church. But generally, any pleasure that's not sanctioned by God is a sin. So instead of abhorring pleasure itself, I think Kirei's disgust was more specifically directed at the idea of enjoying or deriving value from human suffering. Because let's think about what suffering is from the Christian perspective. Human suffering is an ugly, ugly reminder of how the world falls really short of God's original perfect design for humanity. So it started with the fall in the Garden of Eden when well, it could have been the first Adams, we don't know. But yeah, when the first humans, Adam and Eve, ate the forbidden fruit, effectively putting their own desires above God's desire, and that was the original sin. And then ever since then, humans have continued to sin by abandoning God-given pleasures for sinful pleasures, the consequence of which is all sorts of suffering and ultimately death. So where is the suffering in Kariya's case, and why would Kirei feel guilty for taking an unusual interest in it? Obviously, you have Zorkin, a father who should be loving towards his son, but is instead abusive and manipulative due to excessive ambition. And then as a result, the son who should love and respect his father hates and kind of scorns him, but at the same time is racked with guilt for failing his duties and indirectly causing a child he cares about to be violated in the most awful way. He also probably has a thing for someone else's wife, which is both adulterous and causes him even more pain. So from the Christian perspective, the brokenness of those relationships reflects how suffering is the result of people choosing to reject God's way of living and desiring things that they really shouldn't. At most, followers of God can be curious about suffering to try and understand it and then be saddened by it because it's like the very antithesis of God's goodness. And ideally, we're also meant to try and help lessen suffering in some way to, show God's love and to show that God promises eventual freedom from suffering. But to enjoy suffering, as Kirei seems to get a rush out of things that violate God's design, that would imply that you are rejecting God almost. almost. So imagine the terrifying disorientation that Kirei would have experienced at realizing a part of him revels in things that are part of a fallen world and are contrary to God's desires for humanity. What would happen if he allowed himself to indulge in this sinful obsession? Not only would his position as an elite follower of God be questioned, but his very faith and salvation that he has clung to his whole life, or maybe not clung to, but, been guided by his whole life, would be thrown into doubt. Despite all this, Kirei got hooked real bad. For the first time ever, he realized the way that to discover more about this latent desire within him is to win and use the grail, which involves eliminating everyone else. And to his credit, he seemed legitimately disturbed at having to betray Tokiomi and then, by extension, his father. Although, it's probably not what he has to do that scares him. I think he's more scared over the fact that he would do it. The irony is that religion is meant to give you purpose, but Kirei has been dead inside this whole time, alienated from his true self while serving the church. Now that Gil has shown him a way to find his true self, it involves abandoning his faith and embracing something that he's been raised to believe is evil. So in Christian terms, he is choosing to commit further sin to pursue this already sinful desire or obsession of his. So it's no wonder why that we needed just an entire episode to spotlight Kirei's internal struggle. The questions that Gil raised challenged his very identity and his values and his idea of the truth and what's right and wrong. It might very well lead to him abandoning God, or at least his conception of God altogether. Still, I suspect it's a struggle that won't last all that long. I think once Kirei lets go of the guilt that comes with doing something sinful and of questioning things that he has believed to be true all this time, he'll just go all out, maybe even set up situations to increase people's suffering just for the kicks. The moment that Kirei realized his deepest desire flies in the face of the religious morals that he's been raised to uphold really reminded me of Nietzsche, his famous line that God is dead and we're the ones who murdered him. So Nietzsche, he was talking about how Enlightenment philosophy and the rationalism of science rose to challenge Christianity's or religion's role as the arbiter of truth and morality, and even challenged the very existence of God. Essentially, people's desire to better understand themselves and the world around them ended up killing God. Kind of just like how Kirei's desire to better understand his own desire probably ended up killing his idea of God and what is true. Stripping away the certainty that your morals should be determined by an all-powerful God without replacing it with another moral framework could be dangerous. And Nietzsche described the intense crisis that people experience when they are forced to give up on the certainty of a God for the uncertainty of a seemingly meaningless existence. If you don't seize control and sort of reground yourself, you end up mired in this sort of nihilism, or like a sense of despair at the loss of moral certainty and of purpose, which is what Kirei went through this episode shortly. And so consequently, you either resort to distracting yourself from this like existential angst by throwing yourself into sort of senseless entertainment and just hope that your brain doesn't stop to think about why it is you're here on this earth, or you boldly refashion yourself into a new person with a new moral compass. And I think for Kirei, it might just be both. Entertainment, of course, is exactly what Gil is trying to get Kirei to give into. And given how callously that Kirei treats people already, even as a so-called servant of the church, I wouldn't be surprised if once he sheds the moral religious expectations placed on him, that he will more fully embrace his, I would say, psychopathic tendencies and be freer to pursue or even cause the kind of suffering that he finds interesting and entertaining. And in doing so, I think we will see Kirei emerge as this new person, someone who no longer goes along with what religion dictates, but is driven by whatever will bring him the greatest personal satisfaction. First Wave Negativity also pointed out that in terms of emotional intelligence, Kirei is essentially a newborn. I totally agree. Despite his age, right, and his power as a church executor, Kirei still retains a very childlike faith in the things that he's been taught, while also knowing very little about himself. And in another childlike moment, wasn't it interesting how Kirei tried to hide his confusion over Kiritsugu? He gave a really boring report to Archer about Kiritsugu just being some hired mercenary, when really he is struggling to wrap his head around the fact that, unlike himself, Kiritsugu has people who love him, who are willing to sacrifice themselves for him. And Gil, kind of like a dad who, pretends not to see the chocolate stains on his kid's face as they deny stealing any chocolate. He just lets it slide. Like, he's cool. He's like, we won't talk about that for now. It seems Kirei is disturbed by the fact that he and Kiritsugu aren't as similar as he thought. And there's a great comment from the wise wolf on this. When Kirei is talking about Kiritsugu's motives, I took it not as him not being able to decipher them, though that seems to be part of it, but as denial. The flashback is specifically to the scene where he was baffled that Ari and Maya would protect Kiritsugu out of their own will, and later in that scene, he goes to say to himself something along the lines of, he can't have people who understand him. He has to be like me. I feel like Kirei is refusing to consider that Kiritsugu even can have other motives, since that would make him different, and Kirei believes they are the same. That is exactly right. There's a great irony in Kirei feeling that way, because to want to know that someone else is just like you is fundamentally a human desire. And yet the thing that Kirei wants to believe that he shares with Kiritsugu is that they are both less human than most, that they are empty of emotions and have no real relationships, and in that way are set apart from most other people, and in that they aren't tied to any common morality. This conversation ranks as the most interesting one so far in Fate Zero, I think even above the Three Kings conversation, for me at least, probably because I found the religious overtones and their implications quite confronting in a fascinating way. We literally see someone's entire moral compass just being stripped away, leaving something that promises to develop into something quite horrifying in future episodes, I think. And it's horrifying because you realize that maybe the only thing that was stopping Kirei from turning into a full-blown sadistic psychopath was his upbringing and the autopilot, superficial practice of his religion, and that's gone now. So by the end, it felt like Kirei was already getting over his initial feelings of disgust and, any identity crises at harboring such a sinful desire to pursue entertainment in this way, through other people's suffering. And he actually feels hopeful, probably for the first time in his entire life. Red expressed way more poetically than I ever could why this conversation between Gil and Kirei worked on so many different levels. What do I say? Okay. There is so much about it that just works for me. It's set in some sort of study underneath a church. It's between a man of the cloth and a literal demigod from a completely different, technically extinct religion. The conversation is about happiness and the different disturbing paths that can lead to it. The way they speak to each other is so casual, yet so intense. The curiosity and intrigue in Gilgamesh's eyes that only becomes greater as the conversation goes on. The way the tired deadness in Kirei's eyes is slowly replaced with something manic, yet still equally dead. That was a great line. The way they stare at each other with naked emotion. Gilgamesh as if he could see straight into Kirei's soul and wished to reach in and take it, as he believes is his right. Kirei as if he could see a beckoning abyss split open before him at Gilgamesh's honeyed words. Yet those words were also a poison, leaving Kirei so intoxicated that he might very well take the plunge. What depths of depravity would he sink to if he were to take that step and cut himself loose? There are so many good phrases in there. I particularly actually liked the point about this being a clash between the ancient pre-Christian philosophy of hedonism that Gil embodies versus Kirei's rote regurgitation of like classical Christian teachings. The gist of hedonism, there are different strains of it, but in its simplest form, it's the philosophy to pursue as much pleasure as possible in life. Suffering or the denial of pleasure is to be avoided. In fact, there is a famous line in the Epic of Gilgamesh that says, let your belly be full, enjoy yourself always by day and by night, make merry each day, dance and play day and night, for such is the destiny of men. It's a line spoken to Gilgamesh by a minor goddess by the name of Siduri, when Gil was mourning the death of his best friend / lover Enkidu. So some have argued that it's not really a call to take up hedonism so much as encouragement for him to move on with grieving and to move on with life. But that is neither here nor there, because in Fate Zero, Gilgamesh's philosophy is portrayed as the make merry with wild abandon sort of approach to life. And it is set up in direct contrast to Kirei's Christian upbringing, where the ultimate pleasure is to live the life that God wants you to live, which does involve denying yourself pleasure that isn't compatible with being a holy, devout man of the church. It's no coincidence that this clash took the form of a back and forth dialogue where Gil uses, in Red's words, honeyed words to convince Kirei to give in to his hedonistic stirrings. And it feels like a definite reference to the fall as told in the Bible. So there, Satan took the form of a snake and used conversation and suggestive questions to lead Adam and Eve into sin by uncovering their deepest desires. And then lo and behold, we got that close-up shot of Gil's snake-like eye after he uses the exact same technique, conversation to magnify the desire in Kirei's heart to lead him away from his beliefs. And in the same way that Satan had his own selfish reasons for leading humans astray, it's ironic that Gil exhorting Kirei to do as he pleases is a way for him to get what he wants, which is for Kirei to break his pact with Tokiyomi and eventually, I'm guessing, take over as his master. Since we're already eyeballs deep into religion, we may as well talk about the other major religious discussion that took place between Ryuunosuke and Casta. So the two of them discovered their hideout in the sewers has been ruined, and Ryuunosuke naturally was devastated. So Casta very kindly comforted him, saying that, unfortunately, very few people appreciate true beauty. Beauty is fleeting and we have to appreciate it while we can, which is a wonderful sentiment made awfully discomforting by the fact that the beauty that they refer to is the mutilation of kids. So we are in total crazy land. Ryuunosuke then speculated whether this setback was a punishment from God for having too much fun, which triggered a huge response from Casta, who raged that God doesn't punish people, he only toys with them. And it was such a deep personal response because Casta, I think, has a personal vendetta. Well, not I think, it's obvious that he has a personal vendetta against God, but it's not the usual God didn't stop this awful thing from happening to me and therefore I hate him. It's I did these awful things and still God did not punish me. This is a guy who was a military commander who fought alongside Joan of Arc and who would have killed a lot of people in God's name. And if we take that into consideration, it makes sense why Casta wanted to get caught and punished for when he later assaulted and murdered hundreds of kids. He needed to, in my opinion, believe in the idea of a God who is just, who punishes evil, and it would at least justify all the killing that he did on the battlefield. But what enrages him is that in the end, God isn't just. And he thinks that because what got him in the end for murdering kids wasn't God's divine judgment, but the greed of the church and of the state officials who prosecuted him. They used his crimes as an excuse to execute him and then get his property. At least that is Castor's take on what happened. You can't rule out that possibility, but at the end of the day, he did commit numerous aggravated murders. So I think what matters is that he was punished regardless of the path that it took to get there. Some people would say that God uses imperfect, selfish humans to carry out his plans and mete out punishment. But if, like Castor, you don't see that and you only see human machinations at work and the seeming indifference of God to injustice, I understand how you could get to the point of being just so bitterly disappointed that God isn't the good, loving, righteous being that you were led to believe he is. As an interesting historical side note, in France in 1992, there were some, I guess, rogue lawyers and former politicians who held a mock retrial of Kirei. I don't know why they thought it was a good idea, but anyway, they ended up re-examining the available historical evidence and they found him not guilty. They said that he was an innocent victim of the Inquisition, and it's, you know, mostly regarded as a sham, particularly because they didn't really consult actual medieval historians when conducting this mock trial. But yeah, to this day, there are armchair historians trying to exonerate Kirei, and I just thought it was fascinating that there will always be people who play devil's advocate, even in the most horrendous of cases where there was actually quite a bit of documented evidence of someone's guilt. And of course, funnily enough, bringing it back to Fate Zero, the Kirei in Fate would totally disagree with these exoneration efforts because his entire MO is based on the fact that he is guilty, that God, despite his own depravity, did not act. There's a clear parallel between Castor and Kirei. Both were raised to unquestionably abide by the teachings of the church, to base their life decisions on a clear moral framework with right and wrong determined by an all-powerful, righteous God. Both, however, were disillusioned by this image of God, and as a result were led to commit horrible acts, or at least in Kirei's situation, I think he will be led to commit some pretty awful acts. We'll see. There are also differences. Castor, despite how messed up he is, still wants to cling to some conception of God, and that tracks given that he lived in the 15th century where the Catholic Church loomed very large in every single aspect of society, and heresy was punished with not only death but the threat of eternal damnation. Whereas it feels like Kirei never really took to the idea of committing wholeheartedly to God. It's not just that he lives in a much more secular age. It was, I think, also a circumstantial coincidence that his dad just happened to be a church leader, and that's why he was indoctrinated into the faith. Faith, I guess, was more of a childhood habit than a calling. So even though Kirei was distressed at the thought of going against certain religious truths or beliefs, it didn't feel anywhere near the level of Castor's soul-destroying struggle with and rage at God. In some ways, I feel like Kirei is scarier than Castor. Don't get me wrong, they are both psychopaths, and there is no possible way to lessen how depraved Castor is, both when he was alive and now as a servant. But in terms of the how do I explain this? In terms of the potential limits on their wrongdoing, that's where I find Kirei slightly more chilling. He was never the type to be truly inhibited or constrained by any moral framework whatsoever, religious or otherwise. And once he shook off the superficial religious facade, which I don't think will take much, or it hasn't taken much. I feel like he was primed to become a full-blown psychopath, to lean into his natural tendency to be completely unfeeling towards others while pursuing his own agenda. Whereas Castor, even after everything, still wants to believe that a loving God exists. And to me, that suggests that there was some tiny, tiny sliver of possibility of him having been reined in. You know, he's shown that he can be persuaded one way or another as to the existence of God, and consequently the moral constraints that should flow from the acceptance of that fact. The problem was, instead of his conception of God being righted so that he realized his own guilt, it became even more twisted because of Ryuunosuke, who convinced him that, one, God must exist because of all the amazing stuff in the world. Two, that God must love humanity because he puts so much effort into making people's lives very varied and entertaining. And three, that God loves everything about this weird human existence. He enjoys every possible human quality and experience, including all of the bad things like bloodshed and despair. What made Ryuunosuke's spiel truly perverse is that he is repeating what actual Christians often say, which is that the world is so exquisite and rich in detail that there must be a God. The only difference is that most Christians don't include child murder as part of the beauty of this world. The point is, though, there is a crazy internal logic to Ryuunosuke's reasoning, so much so that it echoes some religious traditions throughout history who put forward explanations for what was called the problem of evil. Essentially, how can you say that an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God exists if so much evil and awful shit happens? In some ancient pre-Christian traditions, for example, the Sumero-Babylonian era, which incidentally is Gilgamesh's time, people believed that the gods entertained themselves by orchestrating and putting humans in horrible situations. And I think that's part of what Ryuunosuke was suggesting, but not all of it. He also seemed to draw from dualism theory, or at least a version of it, which says that God is both good and evil. If he is omnipotent and evil exists, then he must have created both good and evil. Because if he made evil things, then he cannot be purely good. So that's another aspect. But I think the worldview that oddly most closely aligns with Ryuunosuke's is something that 17th century philosopher Gottfried Leibniz suggested. And he is on record as being the first to contribute the idea that evil is part of the goodness of this world. So, quote, God considers an infinite array of possible worlds he might create. Being perfect goodness, God would create the best of these. The evils in it, i.e. this world, contribute to the goodness of the whole. This was a view that was heavily ridiculed in Voltaire's Candide, which to this day remains one of my favorite short novels. How bizarre was it to have the words of this very famous, devout 17th century Protestant thinker regurgitated by Ryuunosuke in this twisted form. Sure, butchering kids might be blasphemy, but God allows it. You know, God created the potential for this evil to happen, so therefore it contributes to God's good world as he intended it to. And by terrorizing and mutilating people, we are playing our part in making this world beautiful. I'm about to totally discredit the point I just made about Kirei being scarier, because arguably a religious nut who uses God to justify their horrific acts is equally as scary as someone who totally lacks grounding in any moral framework. I mean, you could say Castor was always going to be the monster that he is. He just needed a convenient excuse and sort of an enabler, such as Ryuunosuke, to divert culpability for his crimes. Here's Kenneth Elder and their spin on this, which I thought encapsulates both Ryuunosuke and now Castor's perception of their behavior. My favorite reading of Ryuunosuke and Caster's revelation is that they view the world and God in an almost artistic and authorial lens, but importantly, a juvenile one. That God is the author of the story that is the world around us. So yes, the darkness is needed for there to be a light, is part of it. Many schools of thought claim the conflict is needed in stories after all. Ryuunosuke, though, seems to see their role almost as a villain, and playing the bad guy can be fun. It is his full detachment from the depravity he commits, to me, is what allows the childish reading of the world around him. But it is that childishness that is also why Ji sees him as pure and revelatory. They will show God's love by being the coolest monsters ever. That was a great point about Ryuunosuke's childishness and therefore detachment from reality, that Caster's revived faith was sparked by seeing someone embrace this depravity as part of God's creation sort of view so unreservedly and naively. And having felt betrayed by the church, who should have been the ones to model true faith in God, here is Ryuunosuke, pure innocent Ryuunosuke, the most unlikeliest of people, reassuring him that he is a true believer by being his own murderous, monstrous self. And it was exactly what Caster needed to hear, to be freed from his confusion over why a good God would do nothing to punish him for his past crimes. If God blesses both blasphemy and devotion, then you are free to blaspheme as much as you want and still be within God's grace. The final thing I'd say about this scene is that it contains another twisted inversion of a basic Christian principle, this idea that one must receive God's kingdom, or in other words, put your faith in God in a childlike manner, which is why I was glad that Kenneth Elder brought up the whole childishness aspect. So that view comes from a story found in the Gospel of Mark, where these kids were trying to crowd around Jesus and his disciples were trying to shoo them away, but Jesus told his disciples off and very famously said, I tell you the truth, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it. And I felt like, again, just so oddly enough, that Ryuunosuke became that child. He embodied something that sounds kind of really Christian-y, but if you look closer at it, is a horrible misinterpretation of the original faith. I felt like we returned to sanity when we switched over to Saber and Irisville arriving at their new hideout. We got another cute exchange where Saber very graciously overlooked the fact that Irisville is an insanely dangerous driver and should probably not be allowed anywhere near the driver's seat. But Irisville, for her part, just said that she's happy if Saber is happy. And I die. I have said this many times before. The happier these two are together and the more that they start to care for one another, the greater the risk, or actually the more certainty that one or both of them is going to have a horrible death, and it is for certain that they will be separated in the most painful of ways. And I'm just trying to inoculate myself from that disappointment. I don't know if it was just me, but there was something worrying about Ari being so confident that their new secret base is, secret. Her trust in Kiritsugu is absolute, but we've already seen that someone like Kirei is capable of catching him off guard. The more I see of Irisville, the more I can't find anything in her to dislike. She is super chill and adaptable, and her very optimistic spirit and sort of love of enjoying the present is such a spot of sunshine in this show. I feel like I've said that several times too, but I will say it again here, which makes it even sadder when Saber started to put two and two together and realized that Irisville's strength is really failing her. And it's not just basic physical tasks that she's struggling with, it's also the fact that she needs Saber's help to distribute her magic and make it work. And you could tell how bad it was just by the panic and the worry on Saber's face. And we're not told exactly what's happening to Ari, but if you could make an educated guess, it's probably the fact that she was a homunculus created for one singular purpose. And now that that purpose is coming to a head because the conclusion of the Grail is drawing nearer, she needs to shut down every other function in her body that doesn't contribute to that final purpose. What adds to the tragedy is that the functions that she needs to shut down include things like her sense of touch, which is linked to a lot of things she enjoys in life, including driving a car. And it reminded me of diseases where parts of your body progressively cease to function as they should, and the frustration and the depression that people very understandably sink into when they are faced with these problems, to say nothing of the difficulties that close family and friends experience too. So it is a real testament to Irisville's strength of character when she is here still putting up a brave face for the sake of reassuring Saber, and I love her. I just love her so much. I think Irisville is a tragic contrast to Kiritsugu. She wants to enjoy the pleasure in life outside of the Grail War, but wasn't born with the choice to, whereas Kiritsugu, as a human, does have the choice to pursue pleasures, but instead shuts down emotionally to devote his life to winning the Grail. And they're united by a common cause and a purpose, but the path by which they both got there and that element of choice, which is so important, are so contrasting. And while Iris accepted her role in this war, whatever that is, because we don't know, there is a real sense of loss when she reflected on how she's not like other humans and will never have what they have. That is the ability to choose what she does with her life. And it really stabs you in the heart. It explains why when she did have the opportunity to enjoy life, she just took it and ran with it. And I think important life lesson there, which is while we still have the chance to appreciate what we do have and take the time to enjoy things that normally you might take for granted, because in reality, you never really know when that choice to enjoy something will get taken away from you, whether through sickness or death or something else. Ryder and Waver, I enjoy seeing Waver become a super frustrated dad who has suddenly been saddled with like an overgrown teenager and having to take him out shopping and listening to him rant about the joys of the modern world, and every so often veering into absurdity and kind of like serious cause for concern. You just don't know if he's going to do some casual plundering if you let him loose in town. I think we hit a major relationship milestone during the conversation that started in the bookstore when Waver learned that Ryder kept conquering new lands because he wanted to reach Oceanus. And I haven't looked into the historical origins of this push towards the east, but clearly Oceanus symbolizes Iskander's very far off, impossible dream, or really any goal that appears unattainable. And it led to a reiteration of the first time that Ryder called Waver out for narrowing his horizons, for basing his ambitions and desires on what other people generally think is possible or advantageous, or for not being open-minded enough to consider goals that are more out there, that really stretch the limits of his imagination. And then Waver's kind of peevish retort later was calling Ryder out for materializing as this huge, imposing muscle of a dude when historical records say he apparently was a shorty, to which Ryder just kind of laughs and brushes it off and is like, don't trust everything that you read, whether or not he was short or tall or massive, whatever. The point is he doesn't care much about being remembered or venerated by people that came after him, or, the details about his physical appearance or whatever that at the end of the day don't signify anything important. Sure, securing a legacy that lives on long after you die is a nice to have, but to Iskander, if it's just his name that survives the passage of time and nothing else, then he'd much rather have even a fraction of that longevity added to his life, to have actually had more time to live and to inch closer to his dream of world domination. And it's it's precisely why he became a noble spirit in the first place. If you stop to think about it, the dream of conquering the world is one that is inescapably temporary, even if Alexander the Great was given the chance to reincarnate into the modern world and, God forbid, given control of nuclear weapons and hydrogen bombs and whatnot, and managed to stake his claim on the entire world in his lifetime. The curse of mortality is such that whatever you build eventually crumbles, whether in 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years. A new power always rises and takes over, and then the world shifts and the cycle restarts over again. But that is the beauty of an impossible dream. It's like the never-ending chasing of a comet's tail. The specifics of getting there, like the how and the when, don't matter so much as the fact that you have the dream, that you can envision it. It is that really tropey but really true saying that it's the journey that matters, not so much the destination. When paired with such a larger-than-life personality who has already lived to the highest heights of possible human achievement and still is thirsty for more, Waver really gets shoved into a bit of a crisis point. He doesn't feel he could be proud even if he did win the war, because he wouldn't be able to take any of the credit given how powerful Ryder is in comparison. Objectively, it's a very unbalanced partnership. He'd rather die having fought his own war than win by having his servant hard carry. And an interesting question is, was Ryder's assessment of the smallness of Waver's ambitions fair? I think yes and no. You know, if all Waver wanted was to prove to everyone that he's an awesome mage, then it's not impressive in the sense that the focus is all on what other people think of you instead of how you can push and outdo yourself. It's kind of like Ryder is impressed with people who seek glory in breaking the flesh ceiling, which is that's a really weird way to put it. I mean, exceeding what is thought to be humanly possible. However, Ryder is also very cognizant of the fact that Waver is way early in his journey of self-discovery and shaping the kind of larger-than-life dream that he wants to pursue. And if it's not this Grail War, then it's going to be the next one or another fight entirely that gives Waver opportunities to do the impossible. And I really appreciated the sensitivity that is contained in Ryder's reassurance, other than, you know, the very comforting head pat. And I kind of read it as death-defying achievements don't necessarily take place on the battlefield, or the battlefield itself is a metaphor. It could be overcoming personal challenges that are much quieter in nature or unseen, but no less amazing because you were able to persist in pushing past your comfort zone or past your own limits. In response to Waver's self-consciousness about the yawning gap between himself and Ryder, you know, a nobody versus a legendary king everyone knows about, Ryder flips the script by pointing out two very important things. One, that the enemy, the proverbial conquering of land or the world, is astronomically bigger than the two of them. So in the face of such staggering imbalance or scale, they're both really small. So what Ryder is saying is, stop with the comparing you and me, you know, it's pointless. And that is a piece of advice to take to the bank, I reckon. In any field, there is such a powerful undercurrent to compare your work or your success to someone else's who is almost always better than you. You know, there's always someone who's richer than you or faster than you, stronger than you. For example, you know, if you're working a job, you're comparing how much you're paid compared to that person or how prestigious the work is, when really the enemy you should be looking to conquer is yourself. Is this job contributing to me living my best life? You know, does it give me a sense of achievement or purpose? Because that is the fight that everyone faces, or at least that is what everyone should have their eyes on. The second thing that Ryder pointed out is that it's because Wyver, I mean, that's not a bad couple name. waver is weak, that his drive to become great is relatable and even admirable to Ryder. Ryder sees in him that kernel of a special sort of willpower or an overwhelming blindness to impossibility that is the sign for the potential of true greatness. There was a dramatized historical film way back, Amazing Grace, about the political fight in Britain in the 1700s, 1800s to abolish the slave trade. And in one scene, William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister at the time, is with William Wilberforce, both of them aged in their 20s, I believe. They were discussing how unlikely it is that their tiny movement of renegade politicians and activists were going to win against the far more powerful and entrenched economic interests of the slave trade and everyone else who benefited from it. He said, "We are too young to realize that certain things are impossible, so we will do them anyway." And young in this sense isn't necessarily like biological age, but attitude. And it was the same with Alexander, who also coincidentally very young when he found himself in a position of great power. Being self-aware that your task completely outstrips your current capacity and yet striving for it anyway is what maketh the myth. You know, Iskander, he never reached Oceanus, but the strength of his desire made it real. Likewise, the audacity of Waver to forge his legacy as a mage while he was still a student and even to the point of stealing a Grail relic makes him just as big of a powerful idiot as Iskander himself, which is perfect. These two just hand in glove, man. They complement each other in skill and most importantly, frame of mind and aspiration. Far and away, you know, the most communicative and in sync master and servant. That's pretty much it for the main recap. We ended with Soloi still hopelessly in love with Lancer, not by choice really, hoping to get that extra command seal back by defeating Castor, who has himself drawn out all the servants by conjuring a tentacled river monster. The monster itself is basically a PR statement from Castor. He has taken up the mantle for everyone who has ever been played with or toyed with by God, and it's a big F you to God. Ironically, having just gone through like an entire revelatory conversation that established the existence of a God who still loves humanity. But yeah, he's doing all this to show that God isn't the only one who is brilliant at being cruel to people. And this is peak religious extremism, right? Castor's realignment of his conception of God didn't lead him to conclude that there is no God. Ultimately, he instead remained a person of faith, even if he contorted that faith into something totally unrecognizable in order to keep it. Here we go, Season 2, Ep 1, Bloody Battle on the Meon River. Is it too early to start betting on who's going to die first? Here's my thinking, just before we press play. I think Lancer is for sure on the death path. He'll probably die because he sticks to his honor code. Ryder, again, just a feeling because he's been talking so much about this unattainable dream. Plot-wise, they're probably gonna just keep him there where he never quite reaches it. You know, he'll die saying like, even after my death now, I'm still gonna be chasing my Oceanus. That kind of seems like a neat wrap up for his story. And Saber's probably gonna die. I guess, I don't know, protecting Irisville, either or. Irisville will die protecting her. Just, it's going to be tragedy all around, so at least I'm prepared for that. This is a time synced reaction, so I will count down. I am watching from Funimation, so I've skipped the logo animation stuff, and hopefully you guys can sync using the subtitles. So here we go in 3, 2, 1, play. I've got the Air Force involved. Some meta commentary. They're gonna die, aren't they? The humans always die first. Oh, I do remember. It was very cool that Saber can walk on water or run on water because of the blessing of the Lady of the Lake. I like that they include that lore in there. That's disgusting. That absolutely useless. Oh, yeah, the regeneration is too much. Come on, Saber. This dude. Just having the time of his life. Oh, new OP. Love the prominence of the strings. Ah, interesting. Was that sort of a preview into Kiritiga's backstory? Or was it Kirei? Sometimes I still get the two of them confused, physical appearance wise. Kariya. Who was that? That didn't look like Arisville. Ah. Okay, I'm loving that the OP is giving us hints that we will definitely delve into the backstories of both Kiritsugu and Kirei. Do they have a spell where, you know, they wipe bystanders' memories? You know, like in Harry Potter? I guess not. Very much in line with the church's MO. Just cover up after cover up. Saber. I feel like Saber's been here before, just slashing away uselessly. Oh, man, is he gonna do anything? Yeah, it's interesting that Tokiomi uh, does still bow down to Archer. He probably does it though, just because he knows he has to placate Archer in that way for him to do anything. Appeal to his ego. So he can't regenerate from Archer's strikes. Nope. I mean, that's probably gonna piss Archer off. Huh? Fair. Oh man, I guess he's like, I'm bored. Let's pack up our toys and go. Gilgamesh. Yeah. Oh man, Takumi is legitimately scared. I mean, of course he would be. Mm, yep. I mean, I'm just super surprised this isn't already all over the 6 o'clock news. No. No. Does it feed on humans? Does it get stronger when it consumes humans? Yeah, what a way to go. I did not train for this. It's so disgusting. Sound effects are great though. I mean, of course, this thing could get even grosser. Well, I mean, gotta give credit for their bravery slash stupidity. I don't know. Hey, Berserker also come to join the party too. I forgot about that. All right, Waver's got to talk to Ryder about the slapping. Seriously. Oh, man, seriously, Berserker, just going for Asha. Yeah. I wonder why Berserker's not going for Saber though. I mean, this is sick air battle. I was not expecting this. Okay, so Kariya's first to go, I guess. Tokiyomi, I mean, he's very much about promoting the cause of the mages as a collective. Yes. And he actually believes that, you know, even though it's so wrong. Why? That sounds like some tradition bullshit. Ugh, yuck. It's such a weird state situation where you can't entirely blame Tokiomi for his decisions. You know, he's working within a very rigid framework, but he did the best that he could. It's the framework itself that is problematic, really. I'm like, did you really have to destroy one daughter and so therefore was forced to give Sakura away? Is that really a choice? I mean, maybe they could have challenged it more, you know, who knows? And you know, it probably happened to him as well. Maybe he had siblings. It's so utilitarian. I mean, Cuddy is ironically the normal one here. Normal in the sense that he has feelings about using mages who are also people like that. I mean, where did Archer get this cool aircraft? Just made out of his weapons? I do look forward to the moment when Archer is sort of brought down a little bit, you know? He's kind of asking for it, being so arrogant, even though he is somewhat justified. Oh man. Okay. What for shaming the mage collective? So he's more angry that Kariya turned his back on his magery more than the fact that, in a way, he is kind of the reason why Sakura had to be given to Zorkin. Man, he's taken on Archer's language. Ugh. Come on, Saber. We need a moment also for Saber to show that she's not all talk. Even with that bum left arm. Okay, seriously, what are they going to do about all these people just watching this? Ah, this is so disturbing. The high he's on right now. Mensa? You're kidding me. Ah, Kiritsugu. Is he talking to God? Oh my god. My mind is blown. I mean, well, that makes all the sense in the world. Why weren't the other, servants going for Ryuunosuke? Like, he's just exposed out in the open. Wait, but what happens to G though? Because apparently he can still keep going without a master. Okay. Right, because the book is the source of the matter, I guess, so it didn't matter that Ryuunosuke. Well, Ryuunosuke himself wasn't a great source of matter anyway. Saber's noble phantasm, I'm assuming. Finally. And he won't have to use a command seal either. Can she though? I mean, can she push through the arm? Wait, what? He's gonna try and get them to show the chivalry that they have professed to. Is he gonna try and bait Ryder and Lancer into something that puts them into danger? Okay. Yeah, we're definitely just gonna go straight on to the next episode because I need to know what happens. Okay. I mean, it's interesting that this ending song is all about Arasville and Kiritsugu. I keep talking about how Saber is going to be devastated when Arasville inevitably dies, or gets disappeared somehow, but Kiritsugu, can't forget Kiritsugu and the big piece of him that will just die when she goes. I guess she's like his only safe space or zone of comfort that he can turn to and show his true feelings to. Oh man. Okay. Before we start episode 2, am I sad that Ryuunosuke ended up being offed in the very first episode of season 2? I can't say I am, but I think, look, I feel there's a very rich discussion we could have about what he meant by saying that he's had what he wanted right in front of him this whole time and he just didn't know it. Say what you will about Ryuunosuke, but he has this very disturbing gift of putting a new twist on some very common aphorisms. And in this case, it would be the whole don't take for granted what's right in front of you, which is often a thing that humans do. And yet here, the thing he took for granted or didn't know that he had right in front of him this whole time was his own guts. So, man, I don't know. I've got to let that one simmer for a bit. With regards to Tokiyomi and Kariya, I mean, I'm not going to say Tokiyomi is the scum of the earth, even though I think his conception of the responsibility that attaches to anyone who's born a mage is incredibly wrong, or at least disturbing. Again, I guess these characters just disturb us in different ways. I have questions about his belief that you can't have 2 mage kids in the same family at the same time. And if I had more information about the consequences of keeping the kids together, I could make more of an informed decision or judgment as to whether he's just being a gatekeeper for traditions that don't necessarily have to be followed, and that causes a lot of harm to kids who just happen to be born with certain magical abilities. Similar to a lot of past traditions, for example, that the church held on to out of ignorance and fear. You know, in particular, Tokiyomi's statement about how if you have 2 baby mages, one inherits the family legacy and then the other has to be cast out as rabble, which is the term I think he used. And I still want to know why. Like, why does it have to be that way? Why can't you just let live and let live? And when Tokiyomi spoke of having to cast out one of his kids. It's like he was basing it on a number of potentially questionable assumptions. Again, I don't have the full information, but assumptions including that the both of them can't train or work together to build the family name. Also, the assumption that it's a fate more terrible than death to not be given the sole focus of a mage clan to develop your abilities. You know, so what? Sakura gets devoured by worms, but at least she is the sole inheritor of the Mato family magic. And apparently, if she'd stayed with the Torsuckers, she would have either had to compete with Rin or diluted the training that they both would have gotten, or just become a normie, I guess, which to Tokiomi clearly is something worse than death. Or, you know, he called Kariya a dog for being a mage who turned his back on his own heritage. He's just of this belief, this indestructible belief that you can't have two alphas in the same pride. But I want to know who determined that. And I just want to know if he has good reason to believe the things that he does. I was tempted for a moment there to read into Tokiomi's line about not forgiving Kariya for indirectly being the cause of Sakura being sent off to the Matos. Read into that maybe he has some tiny part of himself that does regret giving away one of his daughters, but I just couldn't see like any regret at all. If anything, his anger is entirely directed towards Kariya not following the strict traditions of the mages and bringing shame upon all of them by rejecting his rightful responsibility to his family. None of it is because he had to give Sakura away to creepy Zorkin. In fact, he's going on about how it was a blessing that the Matos requested one of their daughters, and the fact that whether Rin or Sakura win or end up fighting each other, like win or lose, it's all good for the Torsuka name as long as they both get to develop into full-grown mages. And I honestly, that's all there is to Tokiomi. It feels like it's just about protecting time-honored traditions and expanding the glory of the Torsuka name no matter the cost. And if anyone has a more sympathetic reading of Tokiomi, I am all ears. I just cannot see it at the moment, and even more so after this episode. Suffice to say, my sympathy for Kariya only increased because he is fighting a losing battle against not just Tokiomi and his own dad, but the entire weight of the mage institution and all of the accompanying expectations and long-held truths that punishes mages who dare question the ethics of the cutthroat, sometimes cruel ethics that whole institution imposes on people, including on children. And in that sense, I actually feel like he'd be on the same page with Kiritsugu about a lot of things. Time to see more of this train wreck unfold, I guess. Caster is going super aggro at the moment, devastated by the loss of Ryuunosuke, and it's 3 vs 1, but it is against a super aggro and immortal self-sustaining tentacle monster. So if you guys are ready, let's play episode 2 in 3, 2, 1, go. Come on, this has to be Saber's moment to shine. Kiritsuga's cool as a cucumber. And these two just off having their own Star Wars. And the glitching. Oh my god. Okay, so they're both gonna die at the same time. Kariya and Berserker. Maybe? Oh man. Is this gonna be the moment that Kirei stabs Tokyo in the back? This is so stressful. I mean, wait, can't Lancer fix Saber's arm? Oh man, I don't know what he has to do, but like if he snaps one of his spears, the one that caused the injury, does the curse break? Maybe. Okay, so it was Kiritsugu that we saw. Kaneth's somehow still in the game. There were a lot of clues in this OP. Ryuunosuke. Oh man, that was Arisville. That does not look like a good way to go. I do love though that sun-filled room and her look of determination is, you know, reserved for her. Saber too. Oh, okay, that's what Kitsuga was talking about. Lancer has to make a move to enable Saber or lift the curse on her arm. Mm-hmm. Buy time. Good plan. You guys take care of it, man. I'm already trying to keep him in this reality marble. Hey, look at his very commanding self. Hey, look at this trust. I love that this is happening in the context of the conversation that they just had about how they're both in this together. That this is, despite all appearances, an equal partnership. Okay, I'm guessing even if Kariya dies by Tokyomi's hand in this episode, Berserker will still hang around somehow. Because they still have unfinished business with Saber, it seems. Oh no, the kids, protect the kids. Man, look at all this fodder. You guys are just food packets at this point. Okay, what is Berserker's goal here? Oh man. Kariya. He's talking him he's not even gonna have to finish him off. Like Kariya will kill himself this way. Yep. Oh my god, he's gonna burn him alive. There's nothing in his eyes. Just watching this dude burn alive. That's it. Is Kirei disappointed that he didn't have more time to figure out Kariya? Now he's even more mad at Tsukiyomi. That would be nuts. Kiritsugu. Wait, I doesn't know how to use a phone? What? Oh no, she can't. She can't even make a phone work because of her physical functionality. That's right. Hmm. Release it. Using their honor code against him. Like, if he's gonna get that fight with Saber, he's gonna have to somehow break the curse first. Saber. No. Take every advantage you can. He's gonna do it. And then Kiritsugu is gonna take full advantage of the fact that he only has one spirit left too. Shit. Oh man, Kiritsugu is so brutal. Yeah. At least now we're gonna be able to see Saber's abilities in full force. Even though they all just got played by Kiritsugu. Oh. Oh, my reaction. Is he helping or what? Okay, nope, not helping. Hey! Every time Archer gets blindsided, that's a good moment. I think he's fine though, but that's how war is. It's like the fog of war. Something always goes wrong. Oh man, he's not dead yet, is he? I mean, he has to be. Nope. He's not gonna do it. Oh my god. He's healing him. I don't know why I thought he was gonna just punch a hole right through Kariya to see what's inside. Okay, he's healing him, but also it's not. I mean, Kariya is not gonna come out great. Ugh. It's kind of like keeping something alive just so you can play with it a bit more and torture it a bit more. Mithrines. I wonder how much this is costing Ryder. Like, does it weaken his overall abilities having to pull this? Like Gatling gun. Wait, is she gonna do it like a 2-in-1 hit? What's Archer thinking? I mean, he's helping. I mean, Saber is the object of one of his interests too, one of the few things that he is interested in. So there's that. All right, Saber. Ah, finally get to see a noble phantasm. I mean, he wants to see it too. Even Kiritsugu had to stop. Just admire the beauty. Okay, one could see why that would be one of the more powerful noble phantasms. The will of the dying. I guess he's gonna see God. This is him seeing God. Oh shit. And then being incinerated by it. Oh, that's it. Okay, Saber face. He wants her as one of his treasures now. It's not from her. Oh, Ryder. Here we go. The pain is so much that it is beautiful. The regret. The sweetness of another person's regret. I mean, Archer revels in it, and then Ryder's just like, no, I wouldn't wish that upon my worst enemy, which is why I really love him. Mm. Called out. Okay, I feel like in Ryder's eyes, Saber has restored a certain amount of esteem. Even though he still doesn't quite like the idea of what that power comes from. That is so messed. Only I'm allowed to hurt her. Okay, so basically he's doing what Kirei is doing to Kariya, is just keeping his plaything alive long enough for him to enjoy himself. So messed up. Oh man. Okay, great thing. We finally got to see Saber's full power on display, and it was always something that was there that needed or deserved the respect of all the other servants, even though they gave her such a hard time. But also what I found most fascinating was that the explanation of what Saber's noble phantasm actually is, which is the full sum of all of the soldiers who have died for their, I guess, ideals and all of their unsung wishes, all encapsulated onto this one person. And the fact that Saber saw as their own responsibility, like it was her duty to take all of those not unfulfilled wishes, the wishes of dying and dead soldiers, to take all of that upon her own self. It's kind of like a very Christ-like figure in a way. Taking the burdens of the world onto yourself and thinking that you're the only one who can do it. As always, I'm just going to spitball a couple of rough thoughts here before I sign off. There's so much symbolism wrapped up in Saber's noble phantasm being, I guess, depicted as a brilliant beam of light. Light, of course, has always been associated with the saving power of a god or god, and ironically, Castor got the end that he wanted, I feel. Yes, he was incinerated into smithereens, but this light that he was engulfed by took him home. You know, it took the form, or it reminded him of Joan of Arc, who he has been obsessed with this whole time in finding. And two, it resolved a lot of his internal struggles with his faith. It restored him to his hope in a god that he still has a connection to. So again, it couldn't have been a more perfect end for Castor in his mind. And the question is, did he deserve it? That's a question that's neither here nor there, because it is how it is, and good for him, I suppose. The other thing about light is that it can be too painful to look at, and that encapsulated Ryder's view of Saber's whole story. Unlike her, Ryder had the choice to rise up as a great leader and to lead his army, to share with them his dream to conquer the world, whereas Saber had no choice but to become leader. She had a crown foisted upon her as a child and was brought up to believe that the kind of leader that she should be is one who takes upon themselves the total weight of all her people's expectations and dreams, that no one can help share that burden. So a key difference between Ryder and Saber is that Ryder's soldiers were all fighting for their own interests as well. You know, having been infected with Ryder's vision, they were all there as one united unit to fight for what they all collectively want. Whereas Saber's soldiers followed her into battle based solely on her command. Loyalty is the reason that they died, not because of some shared dream that they also bought into. And because of that, Saber is also responsible for all of the deaths that happened on her watch, and the guilt that results from that would have been incredibly unbearable. And it does all go back to how Saber never connected with her people or her knights in the way that Ryder did. To be, what was the thing that she said? To be king is to be alone, something like that. And that's what she believed with her whole heart. So I did, again, appreciate that there was a lot of compassion in the way that Ryder was saddened by how that is the reality that Saber faced as king, unlike Gilgamesh, who, of course, kind of just treats Saber's pain and suffering as something to bottle up or something beautiful to collect and put in his art gallery. I'm bugged. I know there is so much more to discuss, including Lance's very noble choice to break his spear in order to release Saber from the curse. And the fact that they all got played by Kiritsugu, who used the Knight's honor code not just against Lancer, but against Saber too, because there would have been no other way that he could have convinced her to willingly take back the advantage that her left arm gives her. There was also how Kirei, oh my gosh, Kirei saved Kariya for the sole purpose of playing with his emotions and his brokenness for just that little bit longer. An irony is that had Tokiomi just finished the job of burning Kariya alive, horrible though that death would have been, it also would have been a mercy for him, because whatever Kirei has planned for Kariya, I am absolutely certain is going to be worse than if he'd just died. That is it, guys. I look forward to reading all of the insights into everything that happened in just these 2 episodes. There is a lot to think about. So until that happens, please take care of yourselves, and I'll see you then.